Everybody, thank you for coming along tonight. It's an enormous privilege to welcome you to our third annual conference on the integrity of creation, and you can see by the wonderful slide presenting just now the global water crisis, the tiny amount of fresh water on the globe. It is quite frightening, and it is our obligation, our duty to steward that water, not just for ourselves, the human species, but for our environment and for our ecology. So we have dedicated our conference to this wonderful topic, the global water crisis. Thank you all for coming out. My name is Professor Jerry McGill, and I will be your MC, Master of Ceremonies, tonight and tomorrow throughout the conference. We will begin now with a prayer to open the conference with Father Ray French from the Mission Office of the University.
Let us pray. All-powerful God, you are present in the whole universe and in the smallest of your creatures. You embrace with your tenderness all that exists. Pour out upon us the power of your love that we may protect life and beauty. O God of the poor, help us to rescue the abandoned and forgotten of this earth, so precious in your eyes. Bring healing to our lives, that we may protect the world and not prey on it, that we may sow beauty, not pollution and destruction. Touch the hearts of those who look only for gain at the expense of the poor and the earth. Teach us to discover the worth of each thing, to be filled with awe and contemplation, to recognize that we are profoundly united with every creature. As we journey towards your infinite light, we thank you for being with us each day. Encourage us, we pray, in our struggle for justice and for love and for peace. And we echo the prayers of Pope Francis as we begin this presidential conference on the integrity of creation and focus on the global water crisis. We ask God's blessing on our presenters and participants, both here at Duquesne University of the Holy Spirit and around the world. And we pray through the Spirit who always gives life. Amen.
You may be relieved to know that not everyone tonight is going to be speaking with a Scottish accent. This conference on the integrity of creation is an endowed conference established by the previous president of Duquesne University, President Docherty, and its purpose is to celebrate the spirit and mission of our university. Our university is sponsored by the Congregation of the Spiritans, and their mission drives us forward. It gives us a vision for the future as we move ahead. And President Gormley, our new president, supports us wonderfully, inspires us superbly towards excellence as we push this conference forward, especially celebrating the spirit and mission of our university. And President Gormley, I invite you now to come and give us a few welcome remarks.
Thank you very much, Jerry, and good evening, and thank you for your hard work in organizing this conference. We appreciate all of the impressive efforts, and welcome all of you to Duquesne University. And we have a worldwide audience watching on the live stream. It's great to see so many of our own members of the Duquesne community here, as well as those of you who are visiting our beautiful campus here in Pittsburgh, the city of Three Rivers, from other parts of the country and the world. And also a special shout out to our students from Waynesburg University, the Stover Scholars and Professor Larry Stratton from down Route 70 who have come here. But it's wonderful to have all of you. My brother-in-law is a computer science professor at Carnegie Mellon University in Pittsburgh, and I was visiting over the weekend, and he said, I hear there's something big going on your campus this week. And I said, are you talking about the football game? And he said, no, the global water crisis program. But word has gotten around that this is really a very significant event. As you know, water is not only important to all life on Earth, it's also a defining feature of this region. Outside these windows and these walls, the confluence of the Allegheny River that comes down from New York, the Monongahela River, along which I grew up as a kid, that form the Ohio River, which then created the original gateway to the west, because that Ohio River is necessary to get down to the mighty Mississippi, and so it was essential to the early American settlers. This made western Pennsylvania, from the earliest days, a hub of commerce and industry, allowing the shipment of resources into the area and then manufactured products out to the rest of the world. In more recent years, our scenic rivers have actually driven growth in travel and tourism in Pittsburgh, attracting thousands and thousands of visitors each year. But unfortunately, the story of Pittsburgh as really one of the original industrial capitals of this country also serves as a stark reminder of the topic that our keynote speaker will discuss tonight. Dr. Nancy Love, who I had a chance to have a wonderful conversation with at dinner, will explain how declining populations in cities like Pittsburgh have reduced investments in the infrastructure that brings in water from those rivers into our homes and our businesses. Century-old water mains break, unfortunately, almost daily. Several recent high-profile instances of contamination have shut down drinking water service to portions of this city. As many of the students and faculty will remember, just last year we had a major contamination issue in this sector of the city that required us to band together as a campus community, bring in water, actually help our neighbors in this community get through it, which we fortunately succeeded in doing. Our local officials more and more have come to realize and have come to grips with the ramifications of the costs of this serious vulnerability. The solutions identified to address water-related issues are going to have a critical impact on this region as they do the world. I'm a member of the Allegheny Conference, which is a group of leaders throughout this region, and I can tell you we've spent a lot of time already talking about water issues as they confront this particular region and our future. So as cities like Pittsburgh shrink in size, other urban areas and even more remote rural communities, whether elsewhere in the United States or around the world, are continuing to grow rapidly. And those present an entirely different set of challenges relating to water supply. Some regions have too much, others have far too little. Tomorrow, we will hear perspectives on the water crisis that span all the way from the oil-rich deserts of Saudi Arabia to the rainforests of Brazil. And we're especially honored to have with us as one of our speakers a distinguished member of the Spiritan congregation, Bishop Mario Clemente Neto, who is joining us from the Amazon region of Brazil to tell his story. And again, the Spiritan communities around the world have a deep interest in this topic, and so we are very, very honored to have the bishop with us for this program. We'll also consider the unique effects of the water crisis on women and learn about innovative ways to conserve water, demonstrated, for instance, in the living building right here in our own backyard at Phipps Conservatory here in Pittsburgh. Also tomorrow, we will talk about some of the moral implications of this topic as they relate to our whole American way of life. And we'll hear on that topic from Bob Glennon, a renowned legal scholar from the University of Arizona, not Arizona State, who will share some thought-provoking ideas with respect to our water crisis from that perspective. As a lawyer and as a law professor myself, I can tell you that when I came to Duquesne in 1994, part of what attracted me was the interdisciplinary energy that at that time was really beginning to grow in momentum, collaboration among faculty and schools, and the rich network of connections that link this special campus to like-minded colleagues all around the world. These distinctive qualities, I think, are on full display in the stellar lineup of topics and speakers that will be part of this symposium. So again, our thanks to Dr. Jerry McGill and his team for making that possible. The water crisis, climate change, and other aspects of environmental stewardship addressed in these very special Integrity of Creation conferences are far too complex to be solved within any one discipline, any one institution, any one region of the world. At a time when these issues, and I will have to say sadly, have become intensely politically charged, with strong opinions being voiced on all sides, Duquesne is honored to provide a forum of thoughtful civil discourse on this topic, inspired by the Spiritan's call to preserve the integrity of God's creation, which is a fundamental piece of the Spiritan Creed. So may you all learn and grow together tonight and tomorrow. May you be enlightened and hopefully encouraged in your work. And may you all return to your homes, whether they're alongside the Three Rivers here in Pittsburgh or thousands of miles away in distant countries, strengthened in your resolve to help protect our planet and to help protect each other, guided as always by the Spirit who gives life. Thank you very much, and congratulations on a wonderful conference, Jerry.
Thank you, President Gormley, for such inspiring remarks and for your vision and leadership at the university. We're now going to the first presentation, and as President Gormley indicated, we warmly welcome all of the audiences around the world. Some of you are beaming in live, as they say. Beam me up, Scotty. The idea of live streaming is superb, to be able to project out live across the globe. This is the global water crisis, and indeed also the video that we are taping to be accessed afterwards through our media site technology. So there's a very wide international global audience that we welcome and we treasure. Thank you very much. And we hope you enjoy and are inspired by our presentations. Let me tell you a funny story though. Just as we were getting ready, our speaker opening the session tonight said to me, "Jerry, do you have any water?" "Duh." Oh, I said, "Oh, yeah, good point." So I went looking for water. And sure enough, Glory Smith, who is organizing this conference so splendidly, said, "Yeah, we've got it on our cooler, so it's nice and chilled for the speaker." So I said, "Thank you." I had totally overlooked it. So you do have some water, Nancy. It is my pleasure now to introduce Alan Seidler, Professor Seidler, who runs our research office and keeps us on our toes with grant writing across the university. Professor Seidler will introduce our speaker tonight.
Thank you, Jerry. It really gives me personal pleasure to be able to introduce our first speaker, who has provided a lot of leadership, both professionally and academically, in the area of water and preserving our water. I actually, though most people don't know it, actually started my career as a freshwater biologist, both in the Great Lakes and in the Arctic. And this is, for me, is kind of a return, and at the same time, this conference represents kind of a review of what we had hoped we had begun to solve way too many years ago, more than I'm willing to admit, that are still with us, and so still a vital topic today. Our first speaker has spent her career working in the areas of water, working in the areas of engineering, and studying and finding ways to help us preserve and improve our water. Nancy Love, Dr. Nancy Love, is the Borchardt and Gleason Collegiate Professor in the Department of Civil and Environmental Engineering at the University of Michigan. She's also a licensed professional engineer and a board-certified environmental engineer, so she has both practical and academic experience. And she worked as a process design engineer for 3 years, so she's actually been out in the field dealing with these very serious problems. Prior to 2008, Dr. Love was a faculty member in the Departments of Civil and Environmental Engineering and Biological Sciences at Virginia Tech, then moved to the University of Michigan, where her research has focused on the interface of chemistry and biology, advancing human health using chemical, biological, and systems analysis of water systems. Her particular area of expertise is evaluating the fate of chemicals, pathogens, and contaminants in water with a focus on public health and the environment. And she currently is studying the global water quality and the relation to children's livelihoods. She has served or serves as a major advisor for 43 master's students, 23 PhD students, and 7 postdoctoral research associates. 3 of her students were students at Addis Ababa University in Ethiopia, so she has also been exposed to the problems beyond Michigan at looking at the worldwide crisis. She has served as both a department chair and an associate dean, and was president of the Association of Environmental Engineering and Science Professors and chair of the academic committee at the Water Environment Federation. She's published 92 peer-reviewed journal articles, over 250 conference papers, abstracts, presentations, book chapters, and peer-reviewed reports. And I'm not going to read them all because you really don't want to listen to me tonight. You want to listen to Dr. Love. She's also co-authored the third edition of the textbook on biological wastewater treatment. Please welcome me, please join me in welcoming Dr. Love.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. I'm going to stay a little bit away from this microphone here because I like to walk around and move. And I'm going to start by thanking President Gormley for the opportunity to be here at this wonderful and very important session, and thank Alan and Jerry, who's been really wonderful in coordinating my plans for being here and thinking through what would be a good contribution to your conference here about the global water crisis. I normally talk about water at conferences, and I dive into stories about Illumina sequencing and metagenomes and analytical chemistry and mass spec. And I was particularly challenged in a good way to think about what I wanted to talk about here to contribute to the dialogue we're going to have tonight and tomorrow. So I'm your science lecture talk, and my goal with this is to lay the groundwork for some ideas and thoughts and things that you may not be familiar with and may not have thought about. And I believe in talking with some of the other speakers that some of the discussion we will ensue over the next day that will get into some of the moral and ethical aspects of the global water crisis will certainly come out of some of the things that I will talk with you about. So in the pictures that you see on the slides, on the left side is a picture of the city of Flint, Michigan. I've spent the last 16 months I think getting back in touch with myself as a scientist, as an engineer, and as a person by engaging in very important work associated with the Flint water crisis. And I will talk about that tonight at a fairly high level, And I'll go into details as to if you want to talk in more detail about it. There are certain things I can talk about and other things that will have to wait about a month or two before I can. But there's a lot to be learned. There is a lot we have learned from that, and I want to dive into that a bit because it really gets into this context of the shrinking city. On the right-hand side, you see a picture that I took recently when I was in Addis Ababa in July from a Western hotel. And if you look at that picture closely, you'll see that in the forefront of it, it looks like anywhere you might see in Pittsburgh, a nice hotel with a nice parking lot with cars and trees. And just over the fence, 10 feet over the fence, are people who have lives 1,000 miles apart from those who are on this side of the fence. And I'll talk to you about some of the work that we've done in Ethiopia and what I know about Ethiopian water. But let me start, because I am an engineer and I am talking about water infrastructure. One of the things that I think we do really well as civil and environmental engineers is make you somewhat unaware of that water infrastructure that serves you. And so I think it's important to talk about it because much of that infrastructure is either underground or not in your backyard. So I'll start by telling you about the American urban water infrastructure cycle. And you have to start by thinking of the natural environment, a lake or a river where we're going to start our journey. And that's the source in the vast majority of cases in terms of the number of people served. Use surface water, sometimes it's groundwater. And there are more groundwater systems, but more people are served in the United States by surface water. And that water goes through some kind of treatment, and ultimately after that treatment, into distribution systems that show up at the faucet when you turn the faucet on at your sink. From there, we consume the water in various forms. We take showers in it, we drink it, etc. We do various household activities with it, and it either goes down the drain or into the toilet. And then we also use more water to flush that toilet. From there, that drain and that toilet, again, go into pipes in the ground, under our streets, down to the wastewater treatment plant, where we again have a multiple staged, very engineered process that purifies the water so that we can put it back into the environment. We also have stormwater and rain, and as climate change and changes our climate and the frequency and the intensity of rain occurs, the amount of rainwater we see, and over short periods of time the amount of rainwater we see actually stresses these systems because they're not necessarily designed for high intensity rainstorms. But some of that water will end up at the treatment plant. It can actually impede the performance of the treatment plant if you have too much. And then some of it goes right back into the environment without treatment. A lot of it goes back into the environment without treatment. Most of it goes back into the environment without treatment. Depending upon where you are in the country, some of that effluent may directly go back into being into a drinking water treatment plant in the form of reuse. Increasingly in the southwestern United States, that's the option. There are many parts of the country where we actually do that type of reuse by putting it back into a surface reservoir and then quickly put it right into a drinking water plant. So we have quite a bit of reuse occurring in the country that people may not be as aware of. Industry can use a lot of water, and so it will either take it out of the environment, put water that it's used back into the environment, or put water into the wastewater plant. So all of these things interact. One more here is food. The notion of using water to irrigate our food, which we then consume, which then goes back through this cycle again. What I want you to see with this diagram are the many different connections, points, systems that we have. And this is what the civil and environmental engineer does in terms of the urban water infrastructure cycle. We design these systems. I work at every step in this with my students, and I teach about this in my classes. But it's a very complicated system that we've developed over the last several decades in response to our needs to make sure that the water quality is safe for us to consume and for the environment. But let's take a step back and figure out where we are today in terms of infrastructure. So I want to start by talking a little bit about the interstate system. And I like this example because I remember as a kid in Indiana, I grew up in northwest Indiana, when they first started putting that interstate right through the cornfield. It was in the early 60s, and that's when we built our interstate system as a result, an outcome of the federal highway system signed into law in the late 50s. We design our bridges for about 50-year lifespan. So you know where we're at in terms of the state of our bridges and some of our roadway infrastructure in terms of needing to be replaced. And the issue, as is shown on the picture on the right, of a structurally deficient bridge that you cannot either drive any cars on or no trucks can be driven on it, is all too common in our country because we haven't invested in the maintenance required to allow us to transition with new infrastructure, new bridges, et cetera, in a timely fashion. So right now we have a lot of bridges hitting their lifespan at the same time. We can parallel water systems. The water legislation, the Clean Water Act and the Safe Drinking Water Act, both passed in the early 70s. What you see on the left-hand side is an image of a distribution system for a city. Design life again for deep infrastructure, large pipes, water mains that move the water underneath the streets that you don't see while you sleep at night, moving that water so that when you turn the faucet on that the water actually comes out of the faucet. Those pipes are designed for about a 50-year lifespan. Some of the larger ones perhaps a little longer, but you see where we're at in our design life in terms of water infrastructure. We are hitting that point where we have to start investing in a very significant way, and transportation's already at the table because we have a similar situation with our transportation infrastructure. At the same time as we're building our IT infrastructure. So infrastructure investment is really important, and it costs more money to wait until something breaks to fix it than it does to maintain it as you go along. So how do we pay for this? Let's talk about what we've historically done in terms of the federal government's role in contributing to paying for our infrastructure. This is federal contribution on a percent basis to the total infrastructure spending associated with water utilities, highways, aviation, and air transportation. And you can see with the water infrastructure investment from the federal government being in the red, the early in the 70s investments from the various construction grant programs that were enacted when the EPA was formed and so forth, that put a lot of money in to build that infrastructure that we all benefit from today. But increasingly with time, the local governments, the states, the cities have had to, and our bills when we pay our water bill are filling in the gap to pay for water infrastructure maintenance and ultimately replacement, inordinately more so in water infrastructure than any of the other infrastructure that you see from the standpoint of a percent of the total bill paid by the federal government versus the local government. So another way to look at this is, and these are not that these other elements of our infrastructure aren't important, they are. But you can see that in 2014, the $11 per person was the federal investment in water infrastructure relative to other infrastructures that are important to our existence in cities. And if you think back to in the 70s, the federal investment was $76 per person, and the local investment was $35 per person. Today, it's about $11 per person federal investment, $100 per person local investment. So we've moved who's investing in the water infrastructure, okay. But that relies upon then that local government, the local county, the local state, having the money or having the means or having the systems in place to produce that money to invest. That's where the shrinking city discussion will go to. Let's talk a little bit about what's happening in terms of our investment. We need a total of about $123 billion per year in water infrastructure over the next 10 years to get ourselves to what we think of as a good state of repair. Our current investment is about $41 billion, so we're quite shy of where we think we need to be. The number of jobs supported by funding the water infrastructure gap is equal to the employment workforce of an average state, of 16 average states. So there's quite a bit of benefit from the standpoint of employment and jobs by investing in water infrastructure. And of course, at a national level, if you have a one-day disruption in water service, it's quite costly. That happened across the country, about $43 billion in sales, et cetera. So water infrastructure is very important, and I think because it's out of sight, out of mind, we don't think about it, but it really is hitting a crisis point. Currently in the United States, we experience about 240,000 water main breaks per year. And a water main break is a very important issue, not only from the standpoint of losing access to your water, but it can affect water quality if it's not handled correctly because of the interrogation into the pipe and having to prevent materials from outside getting into that pipe. So let's look a little bit at what this means when we talk about water infrastructure that's been damaged or is aged. On the upper left-hand side, you see a corroded lead pipe from Flint. This is what it looks like when that event happened, and I'll talk a little bit more about it in a bit. On the top right is a water main break, water going down the street in the city of Flint. They had 3 times the number of water main breaks during the 2-year period as they were trying to recover from the corrosion event that hit that city. Bottom left is a pretty typical picture of an old pipe with a lot of tubercles, and those tubercles, those bumps inside that you see, are a great place for pathogens and bacteria to harbor and live. It's not that that's a bad thing. There are bacteria in our food, there are bacteria in us, there are bacteria in our water, but we want to be sure that they're good bacteria and not bacteria that could bring us harm. And on the right side is a very unfortunate situation for some city. When water main breaks happen, it's not convenient for anybody. So let's shift to the shrinking city. I've told you that we've moved the responsibility for paying for this infrastructure in the United States to the local governments. And so let's think about how that then translates. There's an increasing experience of what we call shrinking cities. And I've listed some of them here. These are just data that I pulled off. From 2000 onward. Pittsburgh is on this list, of course. And I live near Detroit, and the shrinking city syndrome is very significant, where you have a decreasing population. And the reason that's important for water is your infrastructure underground was designed to move more water than you're using. And when that infrastructure is designed to use more water than you're using, water spends more time in the pipes than it would have otherwise. And that relates to higher water age. So I will come back to that, because a higher water age can translate into lower water quality. I'm going to put Flint on here. The blue cities listed in blue are populations of 250,000 or larger. Flint maxed out at 200,000 back in the 60s. But Flint is a very significant shrinking city, but it's not the only one. There are many. And in fact, let me show you this recently published study by a group of urban planners who have been looking at the shrinking city syndrome in the United States. And what you see, and it's a little difficult, but and I apologize, I'll try to move back and forth between these two sides. You'll see a large core area here with an oval around it. And that area reflects the centroid of what are called not only shrinking, but also declining cities. Declining cities in that they're declining in terms of more barriers to progress for those who live in those cities through multiple metrics. And what you see is it's the Rust Belt. It's where we live. It's the Rust Belt of the United States. Not every city in that orb is declining in population, but significant cities are. I want to juxtapose this with what's called a wellness or a well-being ranking, which is something that's done frequently to look at various elements of well-being in our life. And those elements are a sense of purpose, having a supportive social network, financial stability and security, having a sense of community, and physical well-being in terms of health. And what do you notice about the overlay of our shrinking city with our declining well-being or the lower levels of well-being in our country. They overlap with each other. And I think that's really significant. You see down here, there's some other metrics in terms of those who have a lower well-being score tend to have a lower average income. So it's not just, the economic aspect of this can be very significant. But we just said that most of the investment in water infrastructure has to come from the local areas, people paying water bills, and so forth and so on. So if you have a declining economic base, you're probably not putting your investment into that infrastructure that so desperately needs it. So given that, I'm going to give you a little background on what the different parts of that system underground are that you don't see. You have the water treatment plant that pulled the water in from the river or the lake or the groundwater. And you have high pressure mains. So these mains are the ones that push the water out. And then you distribute off the main using a smaller pipe that distributes it into neighborhoods, which then distribute into even smaller pipes and ultimately to your house. It's significant here that in the blue are the pipes that the utility is by law responsible for the water quality inside of those pipes. Once it crosses over that valve into the yellow, it's your responsibility as a homeowner. And the plumbing inside that house is called premise plumbing. There's a lot of plumbing inside homes. There's a lot of old plumbing inside homes. And this is where the lead service lines are at, in some cases, is right across that valve. So when you cross over the valve, that becomes the homeowner's responsibility. So in addition to paying the utility your bill, you have your home to be responsible for in terms of your water infrastructure. So I mentioned to you this notion of the distribution system. If you were to take this and expand it to a city, you would see some kind of network like this where you have pipes going to each neighborhood, and you can really make out where the streets are because the pipes are below the streets. But what's critical is, again, when you shrink your city, you shrink your demand, your pipes are the same size, your treatment plant, in order to maintain pressure, has to put a certain amount of pipe water in there, your water age increases. And why is that important? The EPA is known for almost 15 or so years, and others have studied this, that water quality problems occur when you have higher water age. So they are chemical problems, biological problems, and physical issues. And the ones that are bolded here are those that have direct impacts on public health. On the chemical side, what's called a disinfection byproduct. We use in the United States chlorine or chloramine. We use some kind of chemical to disinfect our water and maintain a residual in the pipe until it gets to your property. Not necessarily into your home, hopefully into your home, but certainly to your property. And those disinfectants can react with other organic material to form disinfection byproducts. Some of these disinfection byproducts have direct health consequences. Some have been associated with potential cancer risks, et cetera. Maybe other kinds of health effects. So we have to maintain our disinfectant low enough so that we don't produce disinfection byproducts above a certain level that is now regulated. But we do form disinfection byproducts in pretty much every drinking water. The other bolded element here is corrosion control effectiveness, and this goes to the heart of the Flint situation, which I'll come to. But if you don't control for corrosion, you can have leaching of materials from pipes, and if you have lead pipes, you'll leach lead. I focus my work heavily in the biological issues, and so I'll highlight two of these. One is nitrification. It actually is, in some cases of disinfection, ammonia is involved in the process, and because the bacteria live in our pipes, some bacteria can convert that ammonia to nitrate. Nitrate is a primary drinking water regulated contaminant that is particularly problematic for infants and children. So we have to keep, when you have a longer water age, you have a higher potential and probability for nitrate contamination. And microbial regrowth and recovery, and that's where I've been spending my time the last 16 months, really focusing in on this. I've tended to work more on the wastewater side, but the same tools can apply, and I've been really taking a look at microbial growth in these shrinking city scenarios. And so if you have longer water age, you can have more growth of bacteria, And it's not a problem unless those bacteria that are growing are pathogenic. And so there are a certain number of opportunistic pathogens that are in all of our drinking water, but the vast majority of us are healthy and not vulnerable to opportunistic pathogens. The people who are vulnerable to opportunistic pathogens are very young people, very old people, or people who have compromised immune systems for whatever means, be it a medical condition, undergoing chemotherapy, other kinds of issues. And if you have a shrinking city with a larger health disparities that isn't investing in its infrastructure, that has longer water age, I would argue that you are increasing the risk of these kinds of pathogens becoming more significant in those locations. If you average everything over the country, over the national average, you might not see it. But if you look in those communities, I think we need to take a closer look. So design guidelines for water age are really about 48 hours, it's 2 days. We want the water, once it leaves the plant, to get to your tap within 2 days. Sometimes 3 days, that's really a maximum. So I want to keep that in mind because I'm going to show you some water age maps. I also want to point out to you that the types of pathogens that are important, or opportunistic pathogens in our drinking water that are important, are changing. They've changed over time. So this is, for, every year the CDC, or every couple of years the CDC puts forth this wonderful report showing you where all the outbreaks were in the United States that they know of. These are always underestimates because they're outbreaks that we haven't associated with the drinking water that very well could have been caused by drinking water. But in this case, what I want you to focus on is the percentages. So what this is showing you is that all the outbreaks in the 2003-2004 period, almost 70% of them were gastroenteric, meaning diarrhea. They would cause diarrhea. Whereas about a quarter of them were respiratory, meaning pneumonia, okay? And then they break it down in terms of the gastroenteric, which types of agents were responsible. And depending upon which agent is responsible, we might take different tactics in terms of mitigating that problem. I want you to look at what's changed over the last, a little over a decade in time, almost a decade and a half. Well, this is, I guess, 2012, so a decade. That the AGI, or the diarrhea disease causing bacteria, is now about a third of the agents for any given outbreak, causing the outbreak. And the vast majority are those respiratory agents. So what's happened is that the fastest growing risk in water associated with microbiological public health risk is pneumonia-causing bacteria, typically Legionella, Legionnaire's disease. You get that through taking a shower in a bathroom where you have hot water, where it's been growing in your hot water tank typically. That's how you get that. It's not by consuming it. What I need to tell you is that regulated monitoring only targets the gastro agents. We do not monitor for respiratory bacteria in the United States. That's not part of our regulatory scheme. Utilities are not required to check for it. So I think there's a disconnect between the regulations we put in place in the 70s and what's happening today in our infrastructure. And the role of the pipes in enabling this is very unclear. This is a very active area of research. And not only is it the role that these aging water mains in our streets play, but the role that the premise plumbing in your house plays. And the way in which you maintain your hot water heater, whether you have an electric hot water heater versus a gas hot water heater, et cetera. All of these things can contribute to differentiating which opportunistic pathogen may be present in your water. It should be no surprise, although most of the majority of the public does not know what I just told you. Nevertheless, we don't trust our water. The Gallup does an annual, I think, survey of Americans' concerns about water pollution. And except for 1 year that I see here, more than 50% of the American public is greatly concerned about their drinking water. Okay? On the way here, I spoke to the Lyft driver who picked me up from my house and took me to the airport, and then the person who drove me from the airport to the hotel. Both of them wanted to talk about their water. Both of them were concerned about their water. It was really interesting. I didn't even really have to start the conversation other than I'm going to go talk about water, and they went right into their concern about drinking water. And you can see somewhat of a Flint effect here possibly, but I think it was going up even before that happened. So it shouldn't be a surprise that then we try to take things into our own hands as consumers, and we put in home-based treatment systems, point-of-use filters. We buy the filter pitchers that you pour water in, and you drink your water from that. And that statistic of a 2 to 4% growth per year is before Flint. The vast majority of what I've been studying has been point-of-use filters and the role they play in changing the microbiome. They change the organisms that are present in the water you produce with that filter. I do not use a point-of-use filter. I'm not going to talk a lot about them today. If you want to know more, I'll be around until tomorrow. I'll tell you more. But if you use a point-of-use filter, and if you have to, and in Flint they had to, I'll talk about that. There are ways to deal with that by adding additional steps of treatment. I also want to bring in some of the disparities in that statistic about our concern about water. It is inordinately people who are non-white and low income who are most concerned about their water, and relative to whites and relative to people who are in the higher economic bracket. And so again, shrinking cities, health disparities, areas where we don't have investment, people who are experiencing issues where they suspect their water. I don't know all of the aspects I don't think we're studying all the aspects that can be contributing to this response, but I do think that we have some disparities, not only from the standpoint of the quality of the water, but who has access to the better water. So this is kind of in my head right now thinking, where we have the aging water infrastructure underinvestment, high water age, and emerging pathogens surrounding the complication of shrinking cities, declining cities with higher levels of poverty, an inability to pay for that infrastructure, and some health disparities. And so where we're focused on, and a number of people are starting to focus on, is this notion that people who are in shrinking, declining U.S. cities are vulnerable to a higher risk associated with their drinking water. And something that we can address, we know how to address it, but we have to have the will to address it. So let me take you a little bit into the Flint situation. I could spend 5 days telling you about Flint, so I only have a little bit of time, but let me tell you the highlights. This is a map of the city of Flint, and it's a heat map. The darker red areas are blight. It's a heat map of the blight in the city. So you can see kind of within this map that it's really the western side of the city where you have most of the areas where homes have been abandoned and have had to be raised, or if they're not raised, typically what the utility will do is they will remove the plumbing or pour concrete into the service line going into the house to try and prevent water leaks and so forth. But that doesn't happen in every house. Let's see what that looks like. So this is a Google map of a neighborhood in Flint, and typically within any given block you would see about 20 houses. And what you're seeing is, maybe 5 houses or so in any given block. So if we zoom down to the street level, this is what you see. Now, this person on the left here still lives in their house, uses the water that comes through the water line into their street. But you see that there are several lots where the house has been removed or the house is abandoned. And so again, this is that water age issue where you quite possibly have water that sits in the pipes for extended periods of time before you actually pull it out of your faucet. And so what I'm going to do is now juxtapose this map of blight with the water age map in Flint. And the red represents pipes at a given stagnant time and moment, because water age moves. This is really a dynamic system, so as water is moving, this map will shift a little bit, but generally the high water age area is on this western side, so in the same places where you have those blighted homes, not surprisingly. And the red are water ages of 6 days or more. Now I told you best design practice is really about 2 days, 3 at most. That's 6 days or more. And that's in Flint. The water's coming from Detroit. It moves up about 65 miles up a pipe just to get to Flint. We're not even talking about that time. And the yellow is up to about from about 4 days to about 6 days, and the blue is your better water, okay? So you see these, again, disparities even within regard to the water age and how it manifests in the city. So if you're going to monitor the city, one needs to pay particular attention to these kinds of aspects of it so that you don't under-monitor the areas of highest risk. And so you have to understand the hydraulics of the water system in order to set up your monitoring. So let's talk about what happened in Flint a bit. What I've got here, and this is a slide prepared by my colleague Sean McElmurray, who's at Wayne State, leading a team, a very interdisciplinary team of social scientists, infectious disease physicians, public health people, people working in risk communication, scientists, engineers, on doing monitoring within Flint, very much focused on the Legionella cases and also the point of use filters and their use. So I'm having a hard time seeing this from here, but I'll do it over here. So you see on the top are the health consequences associated with what happened over time, and on the bottom in the yellow are the infrastructure. So this started in 2014 when Flint changed its water from long-standing into the 60s using water from Detroit, but dealing under an emergency manager who was obligated to make financial decisions for the city, and for financial purposes chose to move from using the Lake Huron water that was treated in Detroit and moved up to Flint to treating from a local river, the Flint River. And the Flint River, rivers are always harder to treat than a lake. Rivers change their water quality every day because the water's flowing quite rapidly past. There's many more changes in a river water. They had a treatment plant that wasn't always being used that much. They had practiced working on the Flint River, a few times a year they would do this treatment anyway, but really weren't staffed to do the whole city that way. But they chose to move to the Flint River. But when they made that decision, they made some very critical decisions as money-saving moves, and one of them was to not add the corrosion inhibitor, which, had they added it, would have maybe cost about $1 a citizen per year, maybe $1 or $2. So it wasn't. It was a really critical decision that was not advisable for anybody who studies this would have known. Very quickly, residents observed red water, smelly water, odors in their water, started complaining about it in 2014. Not too long after that, they had some issues with regard to water quality. They had detected diarrhea-based bacteria that should not be in the water. The first case of Legionnaire's disease occurred in 2014, but the public wasn't told about it until it was 2016. So that's one of the issues. They started to have an increase in the number of Legionnaire's disease cases, and it was a substantial increase in both 2014 in the summer and 2015 in the summer. That's when Legionnaire's disease hits. They had issues with the elevated levels of lead that finally showed up in February of 2015, but really again didn't become public until later that summer when Mark Edwards was contacted and appropriately really sounded the alarm about the lead levels in the water. So the point of use filters that we show here, these are the ones you screw into your faucet, were put into place because they're very effective at removing lead. And today there are over 100,000 filters in Flint. I don't know of any place where there are as many filters of that type. These filters and what I study, and I won't get into too much, will definitely remove the lead. They will grow bacteria. You will increase your bacterial counts across the filter. And so that's one of the issues we're dealing with right now is how do you communicate that it solves one problem and that there are other issues, other maintenance practices you need to take into consideration in order to maintain that filter and reduce your risk of other illnesses. So 2016, October, Flint turned back to Detroit water over here, and they've been on it since then. Let's look at what this looked like, though, from the standpoint of disinfectant residual. This is one of the use of disinfectant is what resulted in the development of, I'd say, developed countries. I mean, the ability to keep pathogens at bay in water that allow us to drink water and not get ill. Disinfection is really critical. So this is Lake Huron water from Detroit before the Flint crisis, before the switch to the river. So this is 2013 over the year. And what you see is that the residual tends to be highest in the winter, lowest in the summer. Typical states request that you maintain at least 0.5 to 0.2. State of Michigan is a little vague in their recommendations. Some states are very specific, but 0.2 is typically considered adequate. What you're seeing here are different sentinel sites. These are places in the distribution system where samples are taken to measure the disinfectant residual. They changed to Flint water, the Flint River, and started to treat it themselves, and this is what the crisis looks like. So you can see that you have places where the residual is very high. In some cases, disinfection byproduct residuals were beyond regulated levels. But I want you to look at this red dot down on the bottom. This is Sentinel Site 6, sits right in that red high water age area. They had months or weeks when they could not get a residual in that area. And that's just one point amongst several hundred homes in that area. They moved back off of Flint River water, went back to Detroit, and you quickly see all but that number 6, that red Sentinel site, lagging, but eventually getting up there. So this is through 2016. Today, the residual is actually quite high. They've been really working on this. There have been people looking at the system. I think they have a better understanding. And I don't know what the 2017 data look like, but I do know that the residuals have been much higher. And so, but this is a very long time period for a system to be inadequately disinfected. So to summarize some of the main public health issues that occurred, the ones with stars are the ones that are really proven, I'd say, to be associated with the drinking water and their impact on people. One is the lead. The other is disinfection byproducts, which can only be formed in the drinking water. And the Legionnaire's disease. I think the controversy right now in the Legionnaire's disease is whether or not it was only water that people were exposed to when they were in the hospital that made them sick, or if it was water that went into their homes. And we're involved in some of those studies, and so stay tuned on that. These other things also happened in Flint. I'm not saying they weren't due to the water. There have definitely been some people looking at it. We also have been involved in this. But sometimes if you don't have the samples, you can never go back and prove. So there was a spike in pneumonia, and presumably non-Legionnaire's disease pneumonia. I will tell you that some forms of Legionella are not detected by the clinical test that's used to detect Legionnaire's disease. So we don't know if it was actually Legionella undetected or if there were other types of bacteria that could cause pneumonia. There was a Shigella outbreak in 2016 that has not been proven to be associated with the water, but also not been proven to be associated with anything. They didn't find the source. And skin rashes, extensive skin rashes that also people are still complaining about. So Flint is very complicated. It's ongoing. There are some trials that started last week, which is complicates how much I can talk with you about at this point. But it is ongoing, and we're evaluating the impact of aging infrastructure and high water age on water quality and the possible impacts on public health. But I will say that Flint is one city, and the whole issue of shrinking city, high water age, water quality goes beyond Flint. It's not alone. So let me talk about Addis. It's a place I love, Ethiopia. And it's a city that I go to about every 6 months, and it changes every time I go. There's something new. It's really rapidly growing. And so let's talk about rapidly growing cities. And these are the top 31 rapidly growing cities in terms of rate of growth as measured between 2006 and 2020, anticipated 2020 rates based on where they are today. And the only U.S. city you'll see is right there. It's Las Vegas, and it's right there with Addis. Addis is the 31st most rapidly growing city based on the census data they have. When I talk to people in Ethiopia, they're quite convinced that those census numbers are underestimated, and I think that may be true in many of these cities. These are developing country cities. This is where the growth is. These are cities that have very different infrastructure systems than what we have, and different states of ability to pay for it, as well as needs for different types of infrastructure. And I've broken it out in terms of different continents and countries, just so you get a sense of where these places are. There's also this notion of the Millennium Development Goals, which we've moved beyond and are now working on the Sustainable Development Goals. But the Millennium Development Goals were good in that they moved us towards being mindful of areas where change is needed. And water was involved in the Millennium Development Goals, included, but not as explicitly as it is now in the Sustainable Development Goals. But the nice thing is that the UN and other agencies monitored progress towards the goals. And for water, the goal was access to water. To water that allows for safe drinking water. It wasn't about the quality of the water. It wasn't about the gender equity of getting that water. It wasn't about a lot of other aspects about that water. And so you can see where the target was supposedly met. And Ethiopia is right there. It's on the Horn of Africa. I can't get over here. It's right here, and I'm going to talk about Ethiopia. You see that Ethiopia is listed as one of those countries where the goal was met from the Millennium Development Goals. So we're going to look at Ethiopia and what that looks like in terms of having met the goals of the MDGs. I can tell you that it looks very different from the United States, even though they're in the same color. So here's Ethiopia, and Ethiopia, capital city is Addis. Addis is a city of several sub-cities. And the water system also is reflective of those sub-cities. It's a little complicated. I'll show it to you in a minute. This is my friend, Dr. Agazu Ngusi, who's a professor at Addis Ababa University, who provided many of the slides and details in these slides to me, we've been working collaboratively on water issues between his students and my students for a few years now. And so this is a rendering of the distribution system in Addis. Looks like spaghetti, right? It's pretty complicated. But what I want you to focus on are the words on the outside. There are three main places where they get their water. Two surface water plants, Gafursa and Legadadi. And then down here is a groundwater well field, Akaki. And what I can tell you is these drinking water systems are not unlike our conventional drinking water systems in terms of the steps of the processes they're used. What's a critical difference, however, is our standard in design and engineering drinking water system is that you have redundancy in your design. Not only do you have multiple steps for multiple barriers of protection, but you have multiple units, so if one breaks or it has to go down for maintenance, you have a second one that you can defer to. They have one train. No redundancy. So when something breaks, you don't have water. Or when the power's out, which happens pretty much daily, you don't have water. So you need to know that because of some of the issues associated with loss of pressure, turning systems on and off can actually really deteriorate the water quality. What I want you to see in this graph is how much water is available or the yield of water through these different locations. You can add these up, and you see the total supply is just under 400,000 cubic meters per day. The demand anticipated by 2020 is 680,000 cubic meters per day, and in 2011 it was 515,000. So the demand's already exceeding the supply. There's a lot of bottled water that is used in these places, in Addis and so forth, but you already have an undersupply going on. And so what does some of this look like? So they did meet the Millennium Development Goals, and so we go out in some of the neighborhoods in the slum areas and Addis, and the majority of people who live in Addis are living in housing like this. This is a wonderful addition. This is the standpipe, so the water is piped to this person's home in the city. In some cases, somebody may have a standpipe, others don't have a standpipe and access, and they will go to that person's home, pay a few burr, fill their jerry can, and take that water home. Or get lucky enough to find a line break, which is fairly frequent, and fill your water can up that way. Some of the plumbing that's used in the piping is not the same code piping we would use. This is plastic plumbing. Very vulnerable to a lot of bacterial biofilms and pathogens that we would not normally use. So you see filters throughout the city. Water gets collected on the outside or in a faucet, wherever that is, put into the reservoir and then filtered out, and then you can have your water for your coffee this way. We have studied these filters. We've studied the distribution system. You know, the integrity of the water, even with the filters, is not to standard code for what we expect in the United States. So what are the issues? Reservoir, the river that they pull the water from, but also some of the reservoirs where they hold it, they have a dry season, and sometimes it's very dry, where the water quality deteriorates as the river dries up. Absence of a water safety plan. There's more of a process now of thinking where your highest risk is and how to invest your money wisely. They are not in the state of having a water safety plan. Intermittent supply I discussed. When you have low pressure vents, you are vulnerable to intrusion into the pipe from the outside. And there's about a 30% water loss in the distribution system. This is the groundwater quality. Here's that well field I told you about. The red is contaminated, highly contaminated groundwater. The yellow is moderately contaminated groundwater. And so their well field, as they already are not meeting demand, is vulnerable to not being usable. So this is a city of at least 4 million people, and this is their state of affairs. But when I teach my students and I teach them about water treatment processes, the thing that I tell them is if you learn anything in this class, it's this. The first step in drinking water treatment is wastewater treatment. You have to deal with the sewage and the septage, because otherwise that's going into your source water and you're not protecting your source water. And in Addis, like in many cities in Africa and places that have a similar state of affairs, about 6% or 7% of the community is on sewer. The rest is open defecation, pit latrine, septic tank. Even with the master planning that was being done a few years ago and a new plant that went online to deal with the collected sewage that is treated at a more like a centralized treatment plant like we would have in the United States, that took them from 6% to 7%. And that took over a decade to plan for. So this is what's going to happen. What's going on is that in the United States, we teach our students how to design and build centralized systems. We have the three biggest treatment plants, wastewater treatment plants in the world in the United States. Detroit is one of them. It's the third largest on a rainy day. It's probably the largest. We do that really well, and our textbooks sit on the shelves of the professors in Ethiopia. That's not what they need. What they need is decentralized solutions in the city. And so that's where there's about a handful of us now developing courses to teach our students and share coursework and content with professors in Africa and wherever we have our collaborations so that they can teach their students about the decentralized systems that need to be put into place, not centralized, because they're not going to get there in the next few decades. That's not going to get them to meet their sustainable development goal criteria. We have to go decentralized. There's a very important situation that was related to water, and it's ongoing in Addis. And those who are familiar with this will know what I'm talking about. Back in 2012, 2013, they were doing a master plan for the city. They were developing the master plan so that they could try to increase the access to water, meet that water demand. But to do that required pulling more water out of the ground and pulling more water into the city to meet its growth, which was taking water away from the farmers. And the farmers are inordinately associated with the Oromo people, and there is a long history of ethnic disagreement between different ethnic groups within Ethiopia. That kind of reinvigorated some of these ethnic tensions, and such that last year there were many protests. A lot of horrible, horrible things were happening in terms of young people, college kids, really wanting to see more harmony, change in the government, and it was suppressed. It came out of the efforts to try to establish a water plan for the city. And so that is to be watched. So comprehensive, multifaceted development of Addis's urban water infrastructure is competing with other infrastructure needs. I didn't even talk about transportation. Safety and getting hit by a car is one of the most common ways to die in Addis. And it's complicated by issues of equity and ethnic tension. So it's not as simple as just bringing the engineering solutions in. It never has been. So I've been talking all about infrastructure and water quality and how bad it can be. Let's put it into context a little bit. And so what this is showing you is, in a couple of places in the world, how we die in 2015. So in the top part we have Africa, all people in Africa, and on the bottom I have the Americas. So it's not just North America, it's Central America and South America. But this shows you the health issues that are most important in terms of the top 10 causes of death. The yellow refer to infectious diseases. And not all of them are waterborne, but some of them are, and you can certainly see diarrheal disease up here being the third largest cause for the African region, whereas it doesn't even show up in the Americas. The one infectious disease we have is lower respiratory infections, and that may or may not be bacterial. So how important is this in thinking about water and water infrastructure? As more people are moving into cities, I think it's in the developing world and maybe leaving some cities in the developed world, I think we do need to pay attention to this, and in particular, when we look at what happens in children under 5. And I want you to pay attention to the lower scale here. It doubles when I move over to this slide. So now you look at how children die in Africa and how they die in the Americas. And you do pull in diarrheal disease and sepsis, probably mostly in South America and Central America here, influencing those numbers on the bottom. But quite substantial on the top. And I think that we have to keep this in mind. In the time that I have been up here speaking, statistically 75 children have died of preventable waterborne diseases in the world. And this is a crisis that needs to be solved and addressed. So with that, I'm going to bring closure by talking about how I take my lifetime of working in water and working as an engineer and working in infrastructure, but also starting to work more closely with communities in water and how they connect with their water. What can I do? We all want to do something helpful, and so I think about myself as an educator and a professor, and I could go and work on a specific project, but what I've chosen to do is focus on academic capacity building and recognizing that the solutions in Ethiopia, for example, need to be the Ethiopians' solutions. And to get there, the growth in their higher education, going from 2 universities about 12 years ago to 37 or 40 today, is to develop the environmental engineers and water quality engineers and public health agents and so forth in their country. And so what I do is I partner PhD students at my university. So Cha-Chen Wu is the student working on the filters in Flint and looking at the microbiological quality there. And this is Bible at NAFU, who's working on point of use filters and microbial quality in Addis. And they work together and help each other in their respective moves towards their dissertation. I also work with Bible's advisor, Dr. Ade Desta, who's one of the very few women faculty in the sciences at the university. But on this class where we're moving towards decentralized treatment schemas and bring that into the curriculum, but also on research on a few other projects. And she just got a wonderful prize for some of her research, which I'm really happy for her. So with that, I will close. What I'm going to say is that I recognize that the global water crisis is much broader than what I've talked about. I've really focused on water quality and a very specific component of it. But I do hope that we recognize that where people live, inordinately in cities, this is not going to go away. And I'm going to leave this up while we talk, because in about 2 weeks is an opportunity to imagine a day without water. And in fact, Pittsburgh's utility is a participating partner in this initiative where we can spend a day imagining a day without water and what that's like to really help us really connect more with understanding how important it is, how much we use it, and how important it is to work towards making it so that everybody has access to high quality water like we do. Thank you very much. So I guess I'm available for questions.
I'm sure you, thank you. Hi. Hi. I'd like to ask about wetlands and their potential for using green infrastructure at both ends of the water treatment systems, especially because they could be low cost, they could improve property values in high-end places like Pittsburgh, they could be low cost in places like Ethiopia.
Yeah. Interesting. I have a student who's starting to work in that space. And actually her study is Detroit and Addis. So she's doing a juxtaposing of how green infrastructure and constructed wetlands being among them, what their effectiveness is in Addis, and then looking at the same situation in Addis and Detroit. And I just got a grant where we actually have, and I'll advertise this to the students because not this coming summer, but the summer after, we will go outside of the University of Michigan. But we had just got a grant, international research experience for students to instrument water infrastructure, and we're looking at green infrastructure so that we would actually help make them more efficient. So I have a colleague who works on green infrastructure and constructed wetlands in particular as a stormwater mitigating and water quality improving measure. And we have a student we're co-advising, and he works with putting sensors in place so that the water moves through the constructed wetland at a pace that the constructed wetland can handle when you have one of these high-intensity rainstorms, as opposed to flying over the constructed wetland and not improving the water quality and still causing a flood. And so by using the sensors, you can use upstream storage and then move everything through the wetland versus just a fraction of it. And we're going to instrument that same system in Addis with students designing the system and then putting it on the web so we can watch the data from wherever in the world we are. So hold tight, that's what we're headed towards. And it's a very interdisciplinary team. I didn't bring it up not because it's not important. It's very important. And so it's interesting, and Detroit's got about a $1 billion green infrastructure over 10 years thing going on right now. It is interesting in terms of, that's like in Detroit, for example, it's very important because phosphorus is the big pollutant, and so the constructed wetland can actually mitigate that phosphorus and possibly does more to mitigate the phosphorus than maybe the treatment plant. You know, won't say it too loud, but that may be the true. To Alan's talking about, we didn't talk about the algae. What I'll say though is that on the nitrogen side, that's becoming increasingly a big issue on the algae, and the treatment plant's really important there. But we don't understand the green infrastructure and its impact on the nitrogen yet. So, you know, I agree with you. It's important. I think that it's low cost, helps the stormwater, keeps the stormwater out of the wastewater plant, which is ideal. Some cases also you use constructed wetlands as kind of a tertiary between the effluent and between the effluent and the environment in order to really improve the quality of the water before it enters into the natural environment. I started my career thinking about doing that work, but nobody was funding it. And that's one of the issues that you have in the academic world is you kind of move towards where you can pay students to do research with you. So I'm glad to see that it's actually getting the attention I think it's deserved for a long time. Don't have anything else to add, but I agree with you. You're all very polite. Oh yes, thank you.
What kind of preventive measures would you recommend here in Pittsburgh and nationwide as far as respect for storm drains go, and the effectiveness of the roundabout commuter or pedestrian using them.
I'm not sure I understand your question. So storm drains and pedestrian, I got lost there. I understand the effectiveness of storm drains in terms of not putting contaminants down the storm drain that shouldn't be there and using them only for stormwater. And then I think you're talking about making sure that they're not clogged so that the pedestrian actually can get across the street or...
More in the sense that everyday people typically don't pay attention, much respect to the storm drains in general. Mm-hmm. So there's some things that, like heroin needles and of the like, that get found in such things, at least in the inner cities. Mm. And I was wondering, how can we prevent those kind of things? And then you also have to deal with people in this day and age with people on as many medications as they're on, with that getting into the sewage. How do you retreat those?
Okay. So I don't know that I have a good solution on the storm drains. That obviously is a challenge. I've spent about 10 or 15 years studying pharmaceuticals and wastewater. So I think we have a pretty good understanding of what wastewater treatment plants do and what they don't do. They were never designed for mitigating the pharmaceuticals. And we know, we can kind of categorize pharmaceuticals in terms of highly recalcitrant, somewhat biodegradable, easily biodegradable. And we also have a good sense of how we can change our treatment process to enhance the removal of those that are biodegradable. When it comes to those that are not, personally I think some of the biggest solutions have to do with drug delivery systems. We overdose ourselves with, the way the body works is you have to take a lot more than your body needs in order to get the mass into your cells that you need. Drug delivery systems and patches and so forth reduce that load tremendously. There's a cost associated with it. The pharmaceutical industry, I think, has some of these technologies, and I think moving those forward would benefit the environment quite substantially. But right now, we have the technology to deal with those, and they include sorption, they include advanced oxidation, they include all kinds of technologies. They cost money. So quite, even if you put the treatment at the hospital where you have largest mass, it's not everything. It's obviously those of us at our homes. We pee out more than absorbs into our body in the vast majority of drugs. So it is a challenge in that regard. And again, the technology exists, but the technology exists to treat it, but to mitigate it, I think the technology exists as well, and I don't think that's been developed and implemented as much as it could be. I don't have a good solution. It is definitely a persistent issue. And if you look in Europe where they're starting to deal with this, they've taken some actions towards some very specific pharmaceuticals in terms of advancing their treatment, but also mitigating use and eliminating use. We aren't doing that in the United States right now, and that would be a good place to start. But I will say that our regulatory process is one that doesn't move very fast. There are some chemicals that have been on our contaminant candidate list for 30 years and are still there. So I don't know that I have a good solution in that regard, but I do know that we're not making progress that we should be able to make. Yes.
I was intrigued by the part about the age of water. I've often thought about that. So especially in an older city like this, if you go away for 2 weeks on vacation, if the grade school closes down for Christmas break, is there an increased chance of contamination, and what do you do about that?
You flush. So the flushing is really important. And many building managers know this, or should know this. I do it when I come home from vacation. I turn all the faucets on and I let them run, and I flush through the system. One of the things that has come out of the point of use filter study, we did a flushing study as well to show that if you flush those filters first thing in the morning, If you bypass them and flush the line coming into your house for about 5 minutes, you reduce the bacterial counts potentially on your water coming out of the filter once you pass it through by 10 to 100-fold. So it's significant. So flushing is important. Now, if you're a place like Flint, which has, I think, the highest water rates in the country, and you're flushing money down the drain, and you can't afford it in the first place, and you have a lot of challenges there. So, flushing isn't easy in every situation because of the cost of it, but it is traditionally the way we've thought about handling it. I actually have a student who's working on a little Arduino solenoid valve device. 5 a.m. it'll open up, flush the water, so that when you get up to make your coffee in the morning, your water has been flushed in your house. So, yeah.
Thanks for this lecture. In switching back to Addis, you mentioned some of the limitations of the Millennium Development Goals as they relate to water, that we were really only looking at access and not quality and type and so forth. So I'm curious about your reaction of whether you think the Sustainable Development Goals are an improvement on that, and whether that is the direction that we can really say we're going to be providing this safe water by 2030.
Yeah. So I discussed that in my class this semester, and the discussion is ongoing. But it's certainly progress. At least they listed water as a specific goal, unlike in the Millennium Development Goals, where water wasn't a specific target. But I don't think the Sustainable Development Goals go all the way to equity with water and other injustices that occur around water that need to be a part of it. There are also elements, as I recall, in the Sustainable Development Goals that, what happened was if you had a latrine, you got a tick mark, but if it wasn't working, it was still of no value to have that tick mark because it wasn't working or wasn't maintained. I don't know that the Sustainable Development Goals are going to put us all the way to that end. I applaud the effort to have goals, but we've gone from, 9 to 17 with sub-goals, and I'll be curious to see how the monitoring comes through, because I think that's going to be daunting. So how do we get the data? Does every country report it the same way? Do we really know we're making progress? So I kind of redirect it back to these water safety plans. The water safety plans are tailored to each country or each community or each city, and the water safety plans allow you to look at the risks within your city, the risks in terms of public health, and the risks in terms of economic risk, and help you to prioritize where to put your money. Because you can't spend your money on every problem. And I think the water development plans are part of, or at least emphasized through the Sustainable Development Goals. And I think using some kind of active planning like that is maybe going to be most effective. I don't know. I'd welcome your thoughts on it, but yeah. There's a question over here.
Thank you. That was wonderful and frightening at the same time. And I'm hopeful that we will find a way to invest in our infrastructure, but who knows if we have the will. You raised something about what was happening in Flint with the water, and they were putting point-of-use filters on. And you suggested a concern that you suggested it was very good for reducing the lead, but it might increase the bacterial load that people were exposed to. Did you see an increase in bacterial-borne diseases after that?
So that's a complicated thing for me to answer. It's ongoing and sensitive. There are, one of the issues is how that is monitored. And so when it comes to diarrheal disease, how many of us go to the hospital when we have diarrhea? Most of us don't. So if I go around and I monitor several homes, or my colleagues or members of the Flint community who we hired to train to do all the monitoring, go to homes and they hear the stories, you get a sense that there's a pretty high incidence of people complaining about these kind of GI issues but the data are not the kind of data that public health agencies use. The same goes for the non-Legionella pneumonia. People might die in a hospital and they died of something else, but they got into the hospital because or they might have gone to the hospital because they had something else, but they died of pneumonia. You know, so the pneumonia doesn't always show up on that chart, or so there's some complexities in the data, is what I've come to understand in working with the epidemiologists and infectious disease folks. But we do have, what we ended up doing was we very specifically worked with public health agents to identify what the issues were in the city, and we targeted those issues. We didn't just go looking for stuff because it was academically interesting. When the Shigella incident hit, we went and looked for Shigella, and there were some other things that we have gone to look for that are still underway, which is why I can't say too much more.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Thanks for joining us today. So what are the options for cities that are dealing with population shrinkage and have this water age issue? What options are there for those cities to reduce the risks associated with water age? And then how many communities do you know of in the United States or water systems that are dealing with these water age problems, and kind of what is the rate of population shrinkage that kind of triggers some of these water age issues?
Okay, so, oh gosh, I had something on your first point. So you asked me, go back to your first point, because I have the second one.
What can cities do to deal with water age?
Right sizing. So there's this notion of right sizing. You shrink the city. You shrink the footprint. So Detroit's been looking at this. One of the issues with Detroit is you have the downtown, you have kind of the blighted and areas, and then you have another area that's not blighted. So you have infrastructure going underneath to get to the other side, trying to collapse that in. That's one proposal. It's not necessarily what's going to happen, but that's one proposal. So
close off a block?
So you try to make the city functional in the space that it needs, given the population you have. But some of that can be done by making green space, making parks. That goes into wellness as well. But now you have brownfields you have to deal with, and contamination of soil, and so it's not just turning it into a park. It takes much more development. But this is what urban planners are looking at, this notion of right sizing, which means that's one thing, but you also need to then make sure that your distribution system is looping so that your water just doesn't go out to an endpoint and stop. Some of these older cities where you have, to get water to a neighborhood, you just kind of take a line out and then it stops, is really problematic from a water age standpoint. So that's one aspect of it. In terms of water age, I think that this concept of high water age and its impact on water quality has been around for a while. That EPA report was 2002, but I think with some of the emerging pathogen issues that have just been coming up in the last, like I showed you how the Legionella has shifted, and there have been some other emerging pathogens of concern, and with the aging infrastructure contributing to possible intrusion, not being able to necessarily maintain disinfection residuals, so forth, utility operators are becoming aware of this issue and doing the best they can to maintain that utility. The utility folks are some of the best people I know. They really want this water to be of high quality, trying to get it out there, but they're working with the system that they have.
We can take one last question.
Okay, I think there was one person behind. Yeah.
Oh, and then one over.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, I have a fairly quick one. A great opener for a conference. Tell us about all the problems, and we don't sleep tonight, and hopefully learn about the solutions tomorrow.
I don't use the filter, by the way. But go ahead. I drink this city water.
To get towards a little bit in the way of solutions, can you comment a little about green bonds being a potential financing solution for some of the infrastructure folks?
Yeah, so I have a colleague who focuses in this green financing area, and I don't know a lot about it, I'll be honest with you, but we're starting to talk more, because I do think that we need financial solutions to this. We need innovative financial solutions. to this. And what I have learned from him, and this is about as far as it's gone, is it's better to use the word green as opposed to the word sustainability. And don't get mad at me on that if you are. I don't know why that is, but from the standpoint of kind of financial investment, apparently green works better than sustainable. Anyway, we can talk about that one tomorrow. There's one last question over here. Yeah.
I was just wondering if the age of water and why it's dangerous is affected because of the length of time it's staying in the pipes, or just because water ages, and if it's because just how water is when it gets older, how it's being affected in the water bottles at the grocery store.
Oh, yeah, okay. Very practical question, and one that I obviously glossed over and shouldn't have. The longer water is in pipes, the disinfectant residual decays with time. So the longer it's in pipe, the less residual you have. The less disinfectant residual you have, the greater chance for bacteria to regrow and to grow in those systems. Also, from the standpoint of the nitrate I mentioned, the longer time you have, the greater chance for bacteria to convert ammonia to nitrate and increase that concentration. Bottled water in the store is regulated by the FDA. The water in your pipes is regulated by the EPA or your state, the EPA. And very different processes. If I ever use bottled water, I don't tend to drink bottled water typically, but when I do, I usually read the label. Aquafina, I can tell you, is reverse osmosis ozonated with, as I know that, and it has the word purified drinking water. So it's gone through many steps. I don't drink mineral water. I don't encourage it. I don't recommend it. Some mineral waters are worse than your tap water. They're not regulated by the EPA, different regulations. And you can look at a bottle, it'll tell you what it's treated by. So this is RO ozone. And some of them come from a tap and then RO ozone. So that water is some of the highest quality you can get, except for the plasticizers that might be coming off in the plastic, which is why I don't tend to drink bottled water. Okay, I'll stop there. I'm not trying to scare everybody.
Thank you, Professor Moore. Thank you very much. That's been a wonderful start to our conference. 2 housekeeping notes, please. We begin tomorrow at 8 a.m. in here. Secondly, if you have parked in the university parking garage, please take a parking sticker price diminution out there. And when you apply that little ticket into your parking ticket at the machine, you'll get a reduced price of $5. Okay, thank you everyone for participating. Safe home tonight, and look forward to seeing many of you tomorrow morning.